bands such as Limp Bizkit and Blink-182 almost seem to be revelling in their own stupidity. And I think Radiohead saw themselves as being different from that.
Well, it's this English thing, isn't it, where you try to hide like any sense of like achievement or of success or anything, but
it's like an emotional cloak.
It is, I suppose. Yeah. Wow, that's a bit deep.
Ooh, that's a bit deep for MTV. The computers went down for the lights, so the lights were shining right.
That's ironic, isn't it?
Yes.
You write songs particularly for the ladies?
The ladies.
I'm gonna die.
They're Radiohead. They're one of the biggest and best bands in the world, and which record company is going to tell them what they can and can't do?
Never part of any musical movement or scene, Radiohead have charted a unique course across the international sonic and social landscape since the early 90s. They have created music without the accepted furniture of rock and roll, the hook, the chorus, the guitar solo, and made it both credible and commercially successful. For the first time since the Beatles, a band has redefined what popular music is and can be. And they're still working, still recording, still pushing back the boundaries of sound.
We've always got to remember about any band that comes out of Britain is that social class, whether they'll admit it or not, is an important consideration. And I think there's a great myth that all the great bands came from rough working class backgrounds. The Beatles were lower middle class, the Rolling Stones were middle class, the Beach Boys, if we go to the States, were middle class, Pink Floyd were verging on the upper class.
It was at Abingdon, a public school for boys, that the members of the band that would become Radiohead first met. Indifference towards the values, rules and regulations of the school helped form a bond among them, along with a shared musical passion and ambition. On leaving the punk band TNT, Tom and Colin recruited Ed, Phil and later Colin's younger brother Johnny to form the band on a Friday. Named after their customary day for rehearsals, the band would develop significantly throughout their high school and college years.
All five members came from what were perceived to be privileged backgrounds and educated backgrounds, all of them having gone through higher education in some sense. And what is interesting is that Radiohead in the long run managed to become mainstream to an extent, certainly in terms of numbers shifted and units shifted, without sacrificing that intellectual probing quality and without pretending to be uneducated and without pretending to have a different background. They've never claimed to be anything that they are not as far as their background goes. They're not going to be particularly proud of it, but it's just something that happens.
Both to satisfy the age-old parental demand that they have something to fall back on and to follow their own intellectual interests, every member of the band went on to further education after leaving Abingdon. Tom's passion for art and literature led him to a course at Exeter University, where he developed various musical side projects.
Tom rolled up at Exeter in about 87 or 88, I think it was. He was thrown into this melting pot of musical goings on. This very charismatic guy called Shaq, who was actually a music student. He was one of the few trained musicians involved in this, and it was with Shaq that Tom formed Headless Chickens, who were probably one of the highest profile bands going down there, and they recorded the now legendary Hometown Atrocities EP, which is worth a substantial three-figure sum to anybody who's got an original copy of that. A little later on, a guy called Felix Buxton turned up in about 89 or 90, I think he turned up at Exeter, and he later went on to form Basement Jaxx and did some DJing with Tom, and that was the sort of melting pot where the interface of guitar rock and the new beats.
At Exeter, we were always aware, although Tom, as I said, was involved in the Headless Chickens, that he had this other life back in Oxford, which kept fairly quiet. On a Friday, were on hiatus, and we knew that he'd go back and play occasional gigs, but usually during the vacations. But did give a sense that what he was doing was just a staging post. He became briefly involved in Shaq's follow-up project, which is called Flicker Noise, which was a more industrial, electronic, techno type thing. It was breaking away, although I think he played, Tom did play guitar on that. But by that time, On a Friday was developing. Various people were coming back from their various college escapades, and that was very much Shaq's baby, and effectively in the end that mutated into Lunatic Calm, which had done quite successfully on the industrial techno side, and Tom returned to Oxford and decided they could do something with On a Friday.
After 3 years of academia, the band members returned to Oxford. During their absence, the rock music scene in the city had begun to bloom. Oxford's musical heritage up till that point had been primarily classical and folk, but this all changed with the emergence of the guitar band Ride, who blazed a trail for the rest.
When you see a band that have played in your local pub and come through the local ranks, and then you see them on Top of the Pops, that actually, you know, I don't know, I'm not a musician, I'm not in a band, and I've not been in that situation, but you certainly detected that everyone felt that if Ride could do it, why couldn't they do it, you know?
For the likes of, you know, Supergrass, Radiohead, they were obviously just sort of starting and thinking about, you know, getting their act together or whatever, and, you know, I guess from their point of view, they could see that, yeah, you know, you can be a band here and it can happen. So I guess it was quite, I suppose it's quite inspiring to other people that were trying to do that creative thing.
It opened up the possibilities that when they finished at college, that music was an option. You know, it wasn't just going to be a hobby, you know, to actually do this as something that you were going to do with your life.
On their return to Oxford's live circuit, On a Friday caught the attention of Ronan Monroe, editor of the local music paper Curfew.
Well, I just started running a sort of magazine come fanzine to cover the Oxford music scene. I just left Our Price Records a few months beforehand, and Colin basically took my job. So whenever I went in to deliver the paper, I'd always have a chat with him, and he mentioned he was in a band. I don't even remember if he told me what they were called at the time, and just said that they were playing a couple of gigs and would I come along and review them. So I reviewed that first gig because Colin, you know, asked me to come along to the gig. And although I was impressed then, I think it was the third time I saw them when they played up at the Polytechnic, which is now Brooks, with a couple of other local bands, and it was one of those nights where everything went wrong. I mean, they were the first band on, supporting a band called Death by Grimpers, and, you know, bad sound, everything. Tom was having a tantrum on stage, but it was just fantastic. You know, I mean, it was one of those nights where everybody's either I hate this band or I love this band, and there was such electricity there. And there was that night I just thought, well, I've got to put this band on the front cover because, you know, there's just nothing else like this around. It was just really, really exciting. So, you know, I just said, do you want to do an interview? And they were all up for it. What I didn't realise at the time, they were all living together in the same house in East Oxford, and apparently before I went round they were all really nervous, and I'd only interviewed about half a dozen bands before, so I was nervous enough, and it sort of seems odd now to think that they could be worried about anybody coming to talk to them. But it was, you know, it was a personable interview, you know. Spent a lot of time just talking about music and what we all liked, but the one impression I really got from talking to them was how determined they were. I mean, they were saying, we've got to take this seriously, there's no other way to do it. And you know, a lot of bands say they want to make it, but most bands don't have that thing within them that will actually make them succeed, and there was a real determination. I wouldn't go as far as saying a real fire at the time, not that I saw anyway, but there was such a determination to make the best of what they had, to take their chance, and they obviously did.
Living in a shared house off the Cowley Road, the members of On a Friday took day jobs to pay the rent and bills. While the work itself was fairly menial for the aspiring musicians, it often paid off in quite unexpected ways.
I think the first time I saw them was probably about 40 or 50 people, most of whom seemed to be waitresses from the restaurant where Ed worked. I think the main reason they got the gig in the first place is because the promoter knew Ed worked at Brown's, which is a student restaurant up in St Giles, so we thought, well, he'll bring all the waitresses down, and they did. It was like a front row of a Robert Palmer video.
Made the place a lot more fragrant, certainly more attractive to be in. Whether that's just become an apocryphal story or whether it's true or not, it's a good enough story to retell.
While Colin worked in one of Oxford's R-Price record stores, Tom held down a job at Cult Clothing. But it was his experiences in another day job that became pivotal to his distinctive outlook and lyrics. Nervous child who was often bullied, Tom had undergone several operations to correct a problem eye, and then endured long bouts of isolation whilst he recovered. With the Spanish guitar that he'd received from his parents to cheer him up during one of these periods, Tom, aged 8, wrote his first song about the mushroom cloud of a nuclear explosion. His later return to hospital to work as an orderly in a psychiatric unit was hardly more cheerful. Exposure to the emotional and mental confusion of the patients was bound to mark this sensitive young man, and the themes of torment and dysfunction would later distinguish his lyrics. On a Friday would travel to the outlying village of Clifton Hampden, where they booked the local village hall for rehearsals. Outgrowing that, they moved further afield to the isolated studio, the Cold Room. Competing for rehearsal time with Ride, now veterans of the Oxford music scene, On a Friday worked tirelessly in these converted farm sheds, on pieces that would appear on their lengthy demo recordings.
They were always doing quite a lot of demo tapes, and I'd started just like a news sheet for gigs in the summer of '86, just when I'd started working at Our Price, and there were quite a few local gigs going on. There was a promoter who was doing Friday night club at the Jericho Tavern. The first review I did, I believe, is, I don't think I'd done a live review before that point, although the band had played, was a demo tape, but I seem to remember it had like 15 tracks on. It was quite hard work to get through the whole thing, because normally bands will choose their best 3 or 4 songs, but obviously they had a bit too much access to the music room at school or whatever, and decided that they would roll out their full repertoire. And all I can remember is that it was very much wanted to sound like REM.
One of these demo tapes, which included Stop Whispering, was heard by Chris Hufford, who invited them to record at his and Bryce Edge's Courtyard Studios. A copy of the resulting tape, Manic Hedgehog, was given by the enterprising Colin, still working at Our Price Records, to the store's visiting EMI sales rep and about to become Parlophone A&R man, Keith Wozencroft. He attended a sold-out gig at the Jericho Tavern and, competing with 20 other A&R men, signed the band, with Chris Hufford as their manager, to Parlophone. Changing their name to Radiohead, the band had little impact and sparse airplay with their early recordings, but they continued to gig intensively around Oxford, where they were attracting positive press attention and a growing fan base. Moving to London may have been an option, but it was not one the band seriously considered. From their vantage point in a quiet city with a supportive local music community, London represented a way of life and a music scene from which they chose to keep their distance. The breakthrough for Radiohead, when it came, was from an unexpected quarter a long way from Oxford and London. Creep, a song of apparent self-loathing and unrequited love, with distinctive crunching guitars, was picked up early by a San Francisco rock station, Live 105, quickly crossed over to Los Angeles K-Rock, then to New York, with DJs ignoring the genre and playlisting rules by airing it all over, all day. The shockwaves of the chord it struck with disaffected youth would soon be felt back in the UK and then around the world. But not before MTV had clutched the song in its clumsy embrace.
Bizarrely, it was America that discovered Radiohead. It was pretty much by fluke. It was down to one alternative radio station. They released a couple of singles. Creep had crept into the British charts but hadn't made much of a splash. Most of the music press acknowledged their existence, but they really were seen as also-rans. And then this one radio station started putting Creep on heavy rotation. No one individual can really be blamed for that. But suddenly, you had a phenomenon there, rather startling, especially because the band thought that the single itself had failed, and they really had their backs against the wall. And by process of osmosis, it started going out on all the other college and alternative radio stations in the States. Then they got on to MTV, which was a very bizarre scenario. There was the appalling situation where they were at an MTV beach party where they were looking extremely ill and miming along to Creep while women in bikinis were jiggling alongside them. And they were being, I think, presented as something of a novelty band.
EMI began to put more weight behind promoting the hit song and decided that a video was needed.
When I made Creep for Radiohead, I was pretty much starting out in the business. I was fresh out of film school. I'd made a couple of other sort of indie videos, and really I was doing the rounds of the record companies and just trying to get a break. I think the reason they asked me to do Radiohead primarily at that point was probably because I was cheap. Because obviously, you know, starting out, you're willing to do things on a lower budget and put yourself out to make it good. So I think what they saw on my showreel at the time was that I was, you know, able to do something of, you know, reasonable quality without a lot of budget. And also, I guess some of it was probably quite interesting to them. I'd done work with 9 Inch Nails and some other bands, you know, where the imagery was quite strong. But at the time, I think the thinking was that he was a new band, nobody really knew anything about them, so they wanted to just keep it simple and just present the band doing what they knew how to do, which was playing. And I think, you know, putting them in their hometown with a home crowd gave production value, because obviously, you know, that was something that already existed. They didn't have to hire extras to be excited about watching the band play. At the same time, they couldn't really take them to London and put them in a big venue because nobody would have turned up. So it was really just a way of getting something of the band on film, I guess, from the record companies' view. You know, they would be able to see what the band were like on film. It would enable them to just present the band to other departments, other branches of the company in different countries. And I don't think at that point, to be honest, anyone had really expected it was going to do what it did and become such a big hit. One thing I do remember is in an early meeting, I think, with the record company, I think they had some concerns about Tom having a lazy eye. And I remember thinking, well, what the hell do we do about this? So I think the stylist had like a big bag of sunglasses. There were all kinds of tricks that were going to be tried. And, you know, on the day, I think we went through this whole rigmarole with Tom, who, you know, I have great respect for him. He didn't seem to actually give a monkeys about any of this. I don't know whether it was ever an issue for him, but certainly it didn't seem to be. And I think we all decided in the end that this was actually just very silly and we should just drop it and he could just be who he was. However, having said that, I think from memory that because I'd mentioned this to the cameraman at the time, he had actually put a top light in for Tom, and it was partly for that reason and also partly because it was such a tiny stage that the ceiling was only, you know, a couple of feet above Tom's head. So we'd been racking our brains about how to light him, and I think eventually the DP just stuck a light bulb on the ceiling with a bit of black foil around it and decided that was the way to do it. And of course it gave Tom this incredibly moody look with these hollow eyes and, you know, very strong cheekbones, and it did actually give something to the song, because I don't think we would have ever ended up doing that if it wasn't for this whole silly thing about, oh, Tom's got a lazy eye. And I think a lot of people, that was the first time they ever saw Tom, and he had this very strong, haunted look.
Radiohead's debut album, Pablo Honey, was released to mixed reviews and unspectacular sales. Although Creep would join Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit as an anthem of teenage angst for an entire generation, the intense focus on a single song would weigh heavily on Radiohead.
Do you hate the media's obsession with Creep?
Yes. So don't ask me about it, because I won't answer it. Press laziness means that the only thing they ever bloody write about is that one song. We want to be around for a while, to be given the chance to actually develop beyond that.
To follow up Pablo Honey, the band bypassed the local Oxford facilities and recorded at RAC and the legendary Abbey Road studios with producer John Leckie. Although this became a tough experience for the band, there were positive results. Namely, their teaming with Nigel Godrich, then an engineer, who later became their producer, and the acclaimed second album, The Bends.
I mean, I wasn't prepared for how great The Bends was going to be, really, by, you know, what they were doing initially. And I think The Bends then, I caught onto that a little bit later, but it was one of those records, I'd just gone through a breakup at that point, and so I think I just got a copy of The Bends, and that was when I just thought, man, this group is pretty amazing. The Bends really meant a lot to me, that record.
When you have, for a year and a half, basically people dubbing you one-hit wonders and wanting you to be one-hit wonders, there's great, you know, there's enormous satisfaction that journalists or whatever get out of the fact that you have this big song, and particularly in Britain the media's like this, and you know, and they're desperate for you. They love one-hit wonders, so they can write about it in 10 years' time. Where are they now? And it became a bit much after about a year and a half, and I think we got a bit fed up with it. And that was one of the things with the Bends, you know, all the songs. If something we learnt from Pablo Honey was that we wanted to make an album with 12 singles.
Although the album was perceived in America as an improvement on Pablo Honey rather than a success in its own right, the British press were more complimentary, and the band themselves received praise for the burgeoning musical talent on display.
Johnny Greenwood is probably the most musically adept of the 5 band members, and he can be seen, if you like, as the musical director. of the whole group. But what is interesting is when they are in the studio and they're on stage, they do swap a lot of the instruments around. You know, Tom will play bass on one track and Colin will be playing keyboards or percussion or something like that, as it seems fit. They don't simply pick up their instruments and stick to them in the conventional manner. And towards the later albums, they gradually broke away from listing individual instrumental credits, again moving away from the idea of them being a conventional guitar, bass, drums rock band.
The band, worn out, shaken and tense, left the country and took to the road. They toured the States supporting REM, which proved to be a positive move. Lasting friendships were formed and their indie cred in America grew.
The crucial turning point, it's not controversial to say it, was OK Computer, where they broke away from the idea of there being a guitar band simply creating an album as a list of songs. It was more of a suite that made sense on its own. It was not a series of anthems that people could buy and listen to and then go and see the band performing them live. It was a self-contained unit that you would actually listen to, you would contemplate, you would think about the ideas that were coming off it, even if the ideas weren't necessarily that explicit. All the good old indie rock faves like alienation and corporate greed and self-loathing.
With OK Computer, Radiohead's substantial progression was not simply musical. Tom's lyrics, which had from the earliest days connected with audiences for their openness and sincerity, moved away from the personal, existential torments which had been labelled self-indulgent by critics, and began addressing the torments of society as a whole. Dissecting the modern world and finding moral confusion, apathy and distress at the practices of the establishment, Tom's lyrics attacked advertising, consumerism and a state built on fear through his use of personal and social metaphor.
I think that Tom has this ability as a lyricist, which is a few great lyricists have, is the ability to reinterpret what he feels in a new way that people haven't maybe heard before, but people think that he's writing for them.
Radiohead, I think, perceive themselves to have to an element didactic role, a teaching role, in that they can, they have a responsibility with their great popularity, especially with younger people, that they can communicate political ideas, social ideas, sociological ideas to a wider audience. I mean, the most obvious example of that was in the late 90s when Naomi Klein's No Logo book came out, which is basically a critique of branding culture and globalization, and it became something of a Bible for the disaffected intellectuals, which Tom York was presenting himself, and became quite evangelical. The idea that it was okay to read books and it was okay to use words of more than 2 syllables ran slightly counter to what I think was a dominant feeling in rock music, certainly in the late 90s. And I think Radiohead saw themselves as not necessarily consciously standing up against that and talking it down, but being different from that and having a responsibility that to their fans, that they could show them another way to go.
The highly anticipated follow-up to OK Computer, Kid A, shot to #1 in the UK and gave the band its first ever top spot in the American charts. Pushing the electronics and distortions of the previous album to the foreground, Kid A represented another progressive step for the band. As unexpected as this step was, it was the album's promotion and marketing that provided the biggest surprise. For Kid A, there were no world tours and press junkets, no singles, no music videos. Instead, there were anti-adverts and blips. The internet became the medium and the messenger, and through it, Radiohead redefined the relationship between the band and the media, the commodity and the consumer, and the music and the audience.
Everyone, well, not everyone, but a few people have go, wow, what you did there, the marketing on that was just genius, the anti-marketing campaign. And it was never, we never had any kind of master plan. It was literally a case of what do we want to do this time and what do we not want to do. So we didn't want to make videos, we didn't want to have singles. You know, they were all things that we had a sort of a knee-jerk reaction against it. It was kind of, they were all things that we associated with the darkness and the heaviness and the hard work of what had gone previously.
Although their approach altered slightly with the release of their 5th album, Amnesiac, it was clear that Radiohead's uneasy relationship with the media, and in particular the music press, had forced the band to create their own rules of marketing and publicity. Acting as their own press officers and publicists, the band have used the website and webcam, blog diaries and web chats to exploit new technology to their own advantage. It has also allowed them to preview new work, discuss their interests on their own terms, and promote the various campaigns and causes that they support. Tom's presence at the G8 conference in Cologne and the depth and range of his knowledge helped Jubilee 2000 publicly raise pressing issues regarding the IMF and World Bank. Through the campaign's successor and related organisations, Radiohead continue their well-informed support and active involvement. According to Tom, using the band's fame to attract media and public attention for these causes is the only real use which celebritydom has.
If you have countries on their knees, and really the only way to get them back is to, you know, have a sort of level playing field, is to use the correct corporate terminology. And I think that's really not happening at the moment.
It's clear that Ed and Tom want to know what's wrong with international trade. Their involvement in the mass lobby was fantastic. They worked so hard the whole day, taking part in actually meeting their MP and lobbying their MP. Now, you can't do that if you don't know quite a bit about trade. Standing there and talking to a politician. And they also got interviewed on Newsnight as well, which was fantastic. And to be able to have somebody who has the profile of Radiohead, but is also capable of sitting down and having a discussion on Newsnight about trade is something that the trade justice movement is hugely fortunate to have.
On a personal and local level, Phil has been for many years a volunteer for Samaritans, which provides anonymous counselling and support for those experiencing emotional crisis, loneliness and despair. Radiohead give their collective support to Phil and the organisation's work through providing Samaritans with exclusive recordings, publicity and benefit gigs. Tom and the band, horrified by the reports of the Srebrenica massacre in the former Yugoslavia, responded promptly when approached by War Child to contribute a new song to a fundraising album addressing the plight of the young caught up in the war. The resulting track was Lucky.
In 1995 we put together the Help album, which was for Bosnia. It was just after Srebrenica massacre, and it was recorded on one day and released the following Saturday. And Radiohead's track Lucky was probably, in fact, was the standout track on the record. And since then they've supported in lots of other ways and then got involved in Jubilee 2000, which we are also involved in, which I think Tom was extremely useful for that campaign because he's a very intelligent speaker. He does know what he's talking about. He's sort of respected for that, I think. He's respected as a serious musician. It isn't just seen as just some pop star dipping his finger in.
Radiohead also became actively involved in the Free Tibet movement. In June 1998, they played at the Tibetan Freedom Concert in Washington and at the rally afterwards, with Michael Stipe joining the band on stage to do the vocals on Lucky. Their involvement with the campaign continues.
Radiohead invited us to participate in their tour, and with other organisations we would have a stall at the concert venues each night and distribute material and talk about the issues to people who are coming to the concerts. And this was very useful for us because it allowed us to reach an audience of people who we believed were naturally inclined to get to know about these issues or were interested in these issues. I think the people who follow Radiohead's music are aware that the band are politically active.
By doing nothing, people condone this violence. By doing nothing, by sitting at home watching TV, consuming all this crap, you are letting them get on with it. You are letting it happen. You want it to happen.
By performing at Amnesty International's concert in Paris in 1998, marking the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Radiohead and the other top-name musicians drew media and public attention to the continuing denial and abuse of human rights, dignity and justice around the world. Local Audiences and music-related businesses in the Oxford area, where most of the band still live and work, have long benefited from Radiohead's presence, support and custom. But the only UK concert of the Amnesiac World Tour in 2001 was something special for everyone involved.
When they had their major homecoming gig at South Park in Oxford, they chose one of the acts on the support bill, a local band called Rocket Travolta. The general perception was that Radiohead had been in that position before. They were a little local band, and they wanted to at least give some element of publicity to other local bands that they had faith in and that they thought were doing something worthwhile and creative.
They specifically wanted 2 local bands to be the opening 2 acts on the bill, and they chose the bands themselves along with the promoter.
It was us and Hester Thrall were the 2 smaller local bands. Of course, Supergrass and Radiohead and Sigur Rós have all kind of established themselves, so for us it was kind of quite a big deal, and especially having gone up first, to see all those people and you're just there, like, you've got to open a show for one of the biggest bands in the world.
And it rained during everyone else's sets.
Yeah, we got sunshine. Yeah.
Sunshine.
So there's the sun out for us, and we're there in front of probably about 20 or 30,000 people by that time. And opening for one of the biggest bands in the world, and I think one of their biggest shows that they had headlined. I mean, they had done Glastonbury to that sort of size crowd, but as far as a headline show for them, I think it was one of the biggest things they'd ever done.
And they were like really nervous as well, weren't they?
They were.
They actually messed one of their songs up and had to start it again, like on stage, and it was like thinking...
We'd heard that before, that like a week before they were getting really nervous.
The Kid A tour saw Radiohead taking a gigantic tent around Britain so as to perform in open fields free of the advertising slogans of stadiums and to get closer to their audiences. And their fans have travelled with their own tents to Glastonbury to be with the band in '94, '97 and now in 2003. With Radiohead reunited with friends R.E.M. and PJ Harvey as the weekend's headliners, and showcasing their first studio album in 6 years, the festival's promotion as the major live event of 2003 seems almost an understatement. Radiohead's latest studio album had its conception at twilight in the quiet country lanes and fields of the south of England, where Tom's glimpses of the creeping edges of darkness in the hedgerows would provide its central metaphor. Its subsequent evolution among the palm trees and highways of sunny Los Angeles would give the band back their swagger and strut of the Bends days and be their happiest recording experience. But if this is the colourful pop album they wanted, then its shades are quite dark. The events of 2001 and their aftermath have made it so.
Standing outside Park Bühne where Radiohead just ended up a show that will be remembered for a long time. Despite Tom York's announcement not to refer to today's tragic events, he came back to it in the second part of the show. Did you hear about the aeroplanes? Did you hear about what happened in New York and the Pentagon? He asked the crowd. A lot of them replied in confusion and disbelief, as they had been queuing outside the venue the whole day and didn't know what was going on. Tom dedicated the last song of this remarkable night, Street Spirit, to the US president, saying, "Let's hope that George W. Bush doesn't start World War III."
major themes in Tom's lyrics is whether you choose to deal with the world around you or just keep your head down and avoid the issues. When Primal Scream sang about bombing the Pentagon, there was a sudden backtracking by their label. With their album title Hail to the Thief, which seemingly alludes to George Bush Jr.'s alleged Florida vote stealing, Radiohead faced a similar backlash. But the fear of losing some of their huge American fan base was less important to them than the issues that they raise. But this isn't a protest record. It isn't as overtly critical of the modern world, of the corrupt times in which we live. While they're still ringing the alarm bells, Radiohead have decided to respond to recent events with another unexpected musical digression. A return to the more naive roots of rock. The first sound heard on the album is the first one recorded in session, Johnny plugging his guitar into an amplifier. The sound of Radiohead plugging in and beginning again.